webinar. So let me start by sharing my screen. Do you see my screen?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
But we're starting with 6.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Is this okay?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Right.
So this presentation is entitled Assessment in ELT, the role of construct definition. Let's start with the outline of this presentation. So first we will focus on assessment literacy. Then after defining assessment literacy, we will move to talk about the process of design and construction of assessment methods. So here in this presentation, instead of using the term tests, we will use the term assessment methods because I think there is a mic on Vesna, so it's quite disturbing. So could you ask the participant to mute the mic? Thank you, Vesna.
Yes.
So we said that we will carry on, we'll proceed with talking about the design and construction of assessment methods. And this is very important for us as language teachers, and it's also important for all teachers. Then we'll talk about construct definition in assessment, what is meant by defining a construct in assessment. We will first define the term construct and then move to the process of construct definition. And then the practical side will cover basically this process of construct definition in the assessment of language skills, in the assessment of cultural studies, and the assessment of literature. And here, I'm not an expert or a teacher of cultural studies or literature, but I try to look at these, let's say, fields from, let's say, an assessment perspective. So what should be done in terms of construct definition in these disciplines or areas? First, as I said, all through the presentation, you will see that I am using the term assessment method instead of test. And we are using the term basically assessment instead of testing, because now we look at testing from a broader perspective. So we talk more about assessment than testing, because difference between testing and assessment, testing is the measurement that is based on the use of tests as an assessment method. While, for example, assessment is much broader, and today the tendency is to opt for methods which are broader than tests. We talk about, for example, project-based assessment. We talk about portfolio assessment. We talk about interviews. And these are not basically types of tests. These cannot be categorized under tests. So if we start by defining the term assessment literacy, so assessment literacy, I mean, the interest in assessment literacy started with the Stiggins in the late 1990s, and then more work was done by Linda Taylor in 2000, 2006, and then Imbaluri also explored this. But all of them, they came with the idea that in addition to the knowledge of language, for example, for language teachers, and teachers in general, they should have what we call assessment literacy, a knowledge about assessment. And in this kind of knowledge, we can include, for example, what we call test construction. Is only one component among the 7 components of assessment literacy that we'll see later on. So this interest in assessment literacy, it just came as a reaction to what we can call as basically the general belief that a teacher is an assessor by definition. So it's not only in Tunisia, it's all over the world. Most people think that teachers, when you say a teacher, it means just by definition that he's able to design and construct tests. So it's like an assessment literacy that is there by nature, even though in some, for example, in most, let's say, if we take the local context, in most, for example, EFL programs, we do not include, for example, courses on assessment because we think that teachers know how to design tests. But research worldwide have shown that, research studies worldwide have shown that most teachers do not know how to design their tests according to what we call best practices or what is recommended by basically the people who know about testing. So assessment literacy could be defined as the knowledge that teachers should have about the principles of sound assessment. Another definition is provided by Popham, for example, who said that it's the knowledge that of some measurement basics that teachers need to be familiar with to be able to perform specific assessment tasks in the classroom. So you see the word basic here is very important. So assessment literacy is not basically focusing on the deep knowledge about assessment or about testing, but it is rather focusing on the basic knowledge. I mean, that makes the teacher operational in terms of assessment. Another definition was provided by Linda Taylor in 2009. She said that the knowledge about assessment matters that teachers need when engaged in selecting. These are, from these steps, we have the principles of assessment literacy or the components of assessment literacy. So when they are engaged in selecting, administering, interpreting, and sharing results of a large-scale tests produced, for example, by a testing organization, or, for example, when they are used in the classroom. So we talk about teachers who are able to select material for the test, like a text for reading, administering, and interpreting the results of the tests, so, or assessment methods. So here, assessment literacy can be also be developed. So, and here, if we look at assessment literacy from a broader perspective, it's the kind of knowledge about assessment that teachers should have, but all stakeholders that are related, let's say, to the field of teaching should also have. So here, for example, we have members of national examination boards. They should have assessment literacy. Administrators, those who manipulate the scores that we give them at the end of the year, should also have some knowledge about assessment literacy. Academics, students, parents, politicians also, when they interpret, for example, the results of specific tests like the CZM in Tunisia and the 9e, for example, and also the baccalaureate. They should have some knowledge concerning assessment literacy, and also the general public. General public is very important that they have at least, let's say, the very, very basics of assessment literacy so that they know. And if we look at assessment and testing in general, so testing, from a philosophical perspective, we are talking about testing as a means to deliver what we call distributive justice, is being fair to everybody. So the message that we give to the people and the general public from administering tests like the baccalaureate, for example, it is we are fair to everybody. So only those who merit, they have the right to go to university. And this is related to another principle that we call, which is meritocracy. So this is why, I mean, assessment in general and testing should not be restricted to the context of the classroom. No, because what we are delivering, as I said, it is meritocracy, it is distributive justice. We are saying a message to the people that through these tests, we are showing that we are accountable. We are not basically selecting people in a biased way, and we are just trying to be just and fair to everybody. This is why assessment literacy has, and I remember once a taxi driver told me, he said to me, "You are a teacher?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Say but not. كتعطي فيها المكتوب. So this is the kind of understanding that is related to, let's say, scaling up the knowledge about assessment and its importance, let's say, in Tunisia. So if we move now to assessment literacy, so operationally speaking, let's say that assessment literacy has specific components. So we take assessment literacy and we divide it into components. So, and if we try to define these components, so we are talking about the appropriate content and standards of knowledge and skills that are needed by teachers in order to be considered as assessment literate. So these, okay, assessment literacy, we saw its definition. Now, if we want to be more practical, more operational, let's try to somehow divide these into, let's say, a clear, let's say, components. So these components, they include the choice of assessment methods that are appropriate for instruction-oriented decisions. And second, we have development of assessment methods that are appropriate for instruction-oriented decisions. And
I think your mic is off. So can you turn it on again? We don't hear you. If you can hear me, Moaz, we don't hear you anymore.
Yes, I hear you, and sorry for the interruption.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay.
My son just got in the room, so I had to fix things.
That reminded me of something.
Happen. Okay.
That reminded me of something.
Okay. So sorry for that.
No, it's okay.
Okay. So assessment literacy, as I said, operationally speaking, we should divide it, because if I am a teacher, I say, okay, you have to be assessment literate. You ask me the question, but how? How can I do that? So I say, these are the components. So these are the things that you should have. We have in assessment literacy, we have 7 components. One, and I see the first 2 components are in red for a specific purpose, because the focus of today's presentation is going to be on those 2 components. The first component is a choice of assessment methods that are appropriate for instruction-oriented decisions. So a teacher should know how to choose, or which assessment method to choose for each subject he or she, or let's say they, are teaching. Second, development of assessment methods that are appropriate for instruction-oriented decisions. Instruction-oriented decision means that whether you decide whether, let's say, are you just for formative purposes, for summative purposes, are you just, the test is for pass and fail decisions, or the decision is, for example, to improve or to provide feedback to your learners so that they can improve their performance. And then, apart from those 2, we have administration. As teacher, you should know how to administer your test, when to give your test to your students, and administration, invigilate. It includes everything. And then it includes also scoring and interpretation of the test results of internally or externally produced tests. So basically, if you are functioning with or dealing with externally produced tests like the baccalaureate, for example, you should understand the whole process, because you are just one, let's say, part of a very complex process. You should understand that. If you are talking about your students in your class, so you should know how to administer the test and how to score the test and how to interpret. And we all know that interpretation of the scores have what we call the washback effect. So based on the results, the performance of your learners, you revise the content of the course that you are teaching, your methodology, and the way you provide feedback, and even sometimes your interaction with the students. Because low a low performance of the students does not necessarily mean that they are weak or they are low achievers. The problem could be located elsewhere. And as teachers, we have always to develop this kind of reflective behavior. So basically, the problem could be with your teaching methodology. The problem could be, for example, with the content that is not accessible to the learners. And we can run, for example, some statistical, not tests, but some statistical, let's call them tests. Very simple ways. If you are able as a teacher to transform, for example, let's say, the scores your students get on a specific test into a curve, then you can easily know whether your test is, for example, difficult or easy. And you can easily calculate, for example, the difficulty index or the facility index of your test. So here it's very important. These are indicators. The fourth component is the use of assessment results to make decisions about individual learners or about the components of the educational program. So you use the assessment results, making decisions about individual learners, whether they pass or fail, or the components of a whole educational program or the whole educational program. Sometimes decisions on the performance of the students, they can tell you whether they will keep the program, make such amendments in the program, or, for example, discard the program as a whole. Okay? And then the fifth component is the development of valid test correction procedures. So the way we correct our tests, how do we do that? What are the valid test correction procedures? And this is another knowledge that teachers should have. The way, for example, in some institutions, we use double correction, for example. That's a test correction procedure. If, for example, you don't have this possibility, if one teacher is teaching one course is taught by one teacher, what is the valid correct test correction procedure? Do you ask the person to correct twice? Do you make a scoring key? Do you have a specification, for example, a test specification document? There are different options that can be used here. Then the sixth component is communication of assessment results to the students. How we communicate our assessment results to the students. Do we give them feedback? And in which way? How do we give feedback to the students? In some, for example, practices, feedback, we have some teachers, especially in primary school, they divide the classroom based on their performance to those who are smart and those who are less, to call them less smart. And here, what kind of messages are we sending to our students through such practices? So the way we communicate the results to our learners, that is very important. Do we give them scores? Do we give them scores plus feedback? Or do we give them scores plus a very detailed feedback? So this is very important, especially in writing, for example, or correcting literature or cultural studies. The seventh component is the recognition of unethical, illegal, and inappropriate assessment practices and the uses of assessment results. So sometimes it's very important to know, and I want to go. I don't want to go to very technical here. So the uses of assessment, we can use assessment practices to make specific decisions which are important. They can change the lives of people, but to what extent those basically inappropriate assessment practices they affect the lives of people. So this is very important. So because as I said, some unethical uses, illegal, for example, use assessment tests. So as teachers here, we should be knowledgeable. We should know such practices. So that's assessment literacy. And those are the components of assessment literacy. And as I said, I highlighted the first two because what I'm going to talk about in the upcoming slides is just to focus on the first two components. The first one, which is the choice of assessment methods that are appropriate for instruction. And the second is the development of assessment through construct definition. So when you design your tests, I mean, construct definition here is very important, is one step, but not the whole process. But I consider that construct definition is quite important at this level. So let's start with construct definition. First, as I said, as a teacher, you should know exactly the kind of test that is adapted to which course that you are teaching, to which ability you are measuring, to which knowledge you are trying to, let's say, measure. And this is very important. Second, you should know how to design your test. When we talk about assessment or design of assessment methods, any assessment method, any test is set to measure a construct. All what we do in, let's say, teaching or in assessment is measurement of constructs. And the term construct was defined by Chappell 1998 as a meaningful interpretation of an observed behavior. So when a researcher interprets a learner's score on a vocabulary test, for example, as an indicator of the vocabulary knowledge, then the vocabulary knowledge is the construct that gives meaning to the score. So when you give a vocabulary test or a grammar test or a reading test to a learner, and then you give a score based on the performance of the learner, that score is an indicator about the knowledge the student has in terms of vocabulary. And here we say that we are assessing the construct of vocabulary. So the term construct here relates or refers to the amount of knowledge of vocabulary that the learner has. Another definition of construct by the National Academies, it's quite recent in 2020. It is the knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics that are the focus of an assessment. So a construct is an abstract theoretical concept such as knowledge or proficiency that has to be explicitly described and specified in a test design. This definition is quite important because it gives us some of the characteristics of a construct. So when we say vocabulary knowledge, it is an abstract. It is a theoretical concept. So we cannot basically observe that. We can only have an inference about what the learner achieved in terms of that kind of knowledge or ability. Another definition, so if we may summarize all definitions, so in assessment, a construct is an ability or an underlying attribute or a theoretical idea that cannot be directly observed. It is rather inferred from behavior, test scores, or responses. So a construct, as we said, the knowledge of reading, for example, you want to measure the reading ability, or the reading ability, sorry, not knowledge, the reading ability of, let's say, a learner. So can you observe that reading ability? The answer is no. We can only have an inference from the behavior, the way the person behaves. We can say that he is a good reader, or he requires to improve his performance. Test scores having usually, let's say, more than, let's say, the average, this is equivalent of mastery of the skill or the ability, and having, let's say, below, let's say, the average is an indicator of, let's say, low or absence of mastery of the ability or the responses, for example, the way a person respond. Okay. You can ask me what are, just give us definitions or let's say examples of constructs. So, for example, in education, language ability is a construct. So we say that a person has the ability to use the English language. We talk about English language ability is a construct in itself. And this construct can be fragmented or divided into subcomponents. We can talk about, for example, the construct of reading in English, the construct of writing, and the construct of listening and also speaking. So those four macro skills can be considered, each one of them can be considered as a separate construct that we are measuring. So we can talk about a construct as a whole entity, such as the ability that you have, your ability in a specific language, your ability in English, in Arabic, in French, or in a specific, let's say, or it can be, for example, an ability to, for example, like mathematical reasoning, like critical thinking, for example. So here, if we want to measure the ability to, let's say, think critically of a learner, we can do that. But we should have a clear definition of the construct. What is meant by critical thinking? What are the processes which come into play when we think critically about something? Is this clear? The same thing for mathematical reasoning. And in psychology, for example, intelligence. Intelligence, what is intelligence? So we try to measure the intelligence of a human beings through, for example, specific tests. But the intelligent quotient, for example, the IQ, is a test. But before designing the IQ, we need to, let's say, understand what is meant by intelligence. So most of the time, we think that we know what is meant by intelligence. But if we want to think deeply about it, we discover that we don't know. We are able to, let's say, fragment it into sub-skills, for example. And this is what we do in, let's say, construct definition. And we'll see examples later on. Anxiety, the same thing. Self-esteem. So here, all these are constructs that we try to measure. Later on, we'll have basically some examples of how we define constructs in, for example, language skills, in cultural studies, and also in literature. What are the major characteristics of a construct? Constructs, they can only be inferred, as I said. So they cannot be seen or touched. Intelligence, can you see intelligence? Can you observe intelligence? It is somehow, because like all psychology, we call them basically in a more technical way, those are psychological attributes, like knowledge of a specific or ability to use a specific language, like intelligence, like critical thinking, like reading, like speaking. So we don't know, we cannot observe them, but we only, let's say, try to measure them based on, as we said, behavior, because speaking is a behavior, writing is a behavior, or, for example, and here we get into the field of psychology, and more, let's say, accurately, we get into the field of what we call psychometrics. Psychometrics is the measurement of psychological behavior or psychological attributes. And this is, we use the term construct here. So here, these constructs, they cannot be observed. This is what we do in the classroom. We give our students a test, and then, okay, if they get 15, for example, they say they have a good reading ability. And if they get 5, it means the opposite. So we make decisions based on their performance in the test. So what we see in the test is basically the result of different processes which were functioning, operating inside the human beings, and what we see is just the result in that specific test. So these constructs, the other characteristics that they are assessed through observation, such as observation tests or self-report methods. So these attributes or these constructs, they can only be assessed through, we only observe people. When we administer a test to them, or when you give them, for example, questionnaires or interviews, because those are the self-report methods in which, let's say, people, they try to be more introspective and they try to think about what they are doing, or they try to describe their intelligence, they describe their, for example, ability. So this is how they are measured or they are assessed. And then the third characteristic, they often consist of multiple components. Usually, like reading comprehension, is not just a very simple process. It includes decoding, inferencing, and processing. So it starts, the reading process starts with, let's say, looking at a written script, then it is decoded with the eyes, and then there are other processes which happen inside the brain. Can we measure those processes? No. We can only give a test to the learner and then see later on from the score that he or she gets whether those processes are highly developed, are functioning appropriately or not. So constructs, this is why constructs, they need to be defined to ensure the design of valid and assessment method. So any test, any assessment method is meant to measure a specific construct. So the first thing we should do as test designers or designers of assessment methods is to define the construct. Sorry, there is a microphone somewhere.
I think that there is a... I'm gonna deactivate this.
Okay.
Sorry for that.
So construct definition in assessment. So here we define what is meant by a construct. We try to see the characteristics of a construct. Again, you say that's nice to know the meaning of a construct and relate that to psychology, psychometrics, that's good. But let's try to understand what is meant by construct definition assessment. How can I just operationalize all of that? How can I just, let's say, turn that into, let's say, something that can be transformed into something that is practical? Let's first try to understand what is meant by construct definition. This process involves explicitly delineating the theoretical boundaries, dimensions, and operational indicators of the attribute being measured to ensure validity and avoid construct irrelevance, variance. What is meant by this is that when you define a construct, first, there must be a theoretical definition. What is, if we take the example of reading or speaking, for example, reading, what is the definition of reading? What is reading? Sometimes we think as teachers, we think that
Okay, I think Moise's screen is just frozen, so we'll wait a little bit for him to reconnect again.
you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you. I think you were disconnected for a few minutes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, just okay. Few minutes or seconds?
A few seconds, sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, a few minutes.
No, not a few minutes. Right.
To the beginning. I start all over again. It's not a good idea.
No.
So, okay. So here we said that.
Yeah.
Okay. We stopped right here, I think. I stopped on this slide. Yes?
No. Okay, you were
The one
in
before.
the slide before that. Right.
This one?
No.
Really?
This one, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so we said that this is why those are characteristics of, let's say, constructs, and this is why constructs, they need to be defined to ensure design of valid assessment methods. So now we move to the construct definition. What is meant by construct definition? It means that we need to define this in order to know how to basically construct, how to operationalize all of this. So construct definition means delineating the theoretical boundaries of the construct. It means that identifying its boundaries, dimensions, and operational indicators. And then I explain this through an example. If we take the example of reading, for example, so we think that we know the definition of reading, but actually we don't know the exact definition of reading sometimes, because it is quite complex as a skill, and it includes what we call higher order and lower order, let's say, skills. So why we need to do what we call or the construct definition? Because it is very important, because it ensures that assessment is aligned with construct. It is measuring what it claims. So here assessment method is measuring what it claims. So this ensures what we call construct validity. It facilitates the choice of appropriate questions or tasks. For example, if I am measuring creativity, I know that creativity by definition relies on basically open-ended tasks. I cannot, for example, measure creativity using multiple choice items. And the other important aspect or reason or rationale behind, let's say, defining the construct is that it helps task designers avoid what we call construct underrepresentation. And here I'm going to focus on a very good living example of construct and representation. So here, the Tunisian Baccalaureate English test is a good living example of construct and representation. I worked on this. I know exactly what I'm talking about. So if you look at the documents of the Tunisian Ministry of Education, it says that the Baccalaureate English test is meant to measure the fourth form pupils' English language ability. Any theoretical definition of language ability states that a language ability should include the use of the four macro skills: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. If we do an analysis of the textbook of the fourth form, Skills for Life, and I did that analysis in addition to the other books used for the baccalaureate, it also provides a very balanced coverage of the four macro skills: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. However, the Tunisian Baccalaureate English test, however, is only limited to the assessment of reading and writing skills. This is underrepresentation of the construct. English language ability, by definition, should have or should focus, includes the four skills. If you want to measure that, you should measure the four skills. And this is an example of what we call context underrepresentation. So in terms of process, there are many approaches to construct definition. There is the trait-based approach, the task-based approach by Bachman and Palmer. But I mean, let's skip all of that. It's very theoretical. I mean, as teachers, what we should know is that the process includes basically four steps. The first step is a theoretical definition. It describes the construct in theory. Like, for example, critical thinking is the ability to analyze facts objectively to form a judgment. This is the theoretical definition. Reading, for example, is ability to understand meaning from a written script or written text. If you define, for example, reading as the ability to phonologically produce a written script, now you have a completely different definition, and you end up administering a completely different test. Then, in construct definition, we should do what we call operational definition. In operational definition, you need to specify how it will be measured in the local context based on the level and then test taker characteristics. So here, operational definition. So I take that theoretical definition and then I apply it to the level that I am teaching. So if we take the example of reading, so reading includes, as we said, higher order skills and lower order skills. But if I want to, let's say, design a test of reading for first year students, my test will focus on lower order skills, which means that finding meaning that is explicitly stated in the text. If I want to design a test for third year students, I will focus on higher order skills. My test will focus on finding meaning that is implicitly stated in the text. And how the operational definition, this is how the operational definition basically changes the theoretical definition and makes it more adapted to the context. Now, the third step is identifying the subcomponents. So here you take the construct and you break it into measurable parts. Like, for example, teamwork includes communication, conflict resolution, and collaboration. So when I administer my test to measure the construct of teamwork, I will give items in which learners communicate. I will give them a problem and then a conflict, and I will ask them to resolve the conflict. And then I will give them tasks in which they will be obliged to collaborate. And then in this way, I will be able to measure the, let's say, which is the construct of teamwork. Then the last one, which is align assessment with method. So the course I'm teaching will, or the subject that I'm teaching, or that I want to assess, I need to find the method or the test that is adequate to that specific construct. As we said, critical thinking, for example, cannot be measured through, for example, multiple choice items. Interpretation of a novel, for example, cannot be done through multiple choice or structured items. So depending on the nature of the construct and the task that students will do with that specific ability, I will design I will select the methods. So now let me move quickly to talk about construct definition in language skills. So as I said previously, and I will skip these slides quickly, I see Besma is worrying about the time, so it's about 1 hour now. So language skills are the abilities that enable a person to understand the use of language effectively. So language skills is the use of a language, but basically in communication. So my assessment, this is a definition. The construct says that language skills, a set of abilities enable people to understand and use language in communication. So here we say that any task that is not communicative cannot be included in a test that is measuring language ability, because the nature of, let's say, the construct itself relates to communication, like listening, speaking, and reading and writing. Two of them are, let's say, productive, and the other two are receptive. And these skills, if we move to the subcomponents of these skills, each component, basically, it includes a combination of the four, let's say, subcomponents. Linguistic competence, so in order to speak, you need knowledge of grammar, knowledge of vocab, pronunciation, and spelling. Sociolinguistic competence, I mean, using, let's say, the language in a specific context. And this is why, let's say, the items that do not engage learners in a task that is socially contextualized are not appropriate for measuring language ability or language skills. Pragmatic competence, the same thing, discourse and meaning. So we say that basically the items in a task, they should be meaningful to the learners so that they can basically get engaged with such, let's say, items. Strategic competence, using strategies to overcome basically communication gaps. So this also another subcomponents of language skills. So As I said, when I mentioned this, so reading, we have a theoretical definition. There is multidimensional construct. There are higher order skills and lower order skills. And usually we have these subcomponents in reading. There is decoding, there is word recognition, there is language comprehension, there is text integration, interpretation, and there is metacognitive strategies, and then motivation and engagement. So all these need to figure in the items, but the difference between the items is basically, or selection of the items is basically done in the operational definition. So we do not talk, for example, about metacognitive, let's say, in strategic skills with the basic, or let's say, basic levels or elementary levels. These are basically what the items we design are for, let's say, more advanced levels. Operational definition, the construct here, reading as having several components, it will vary according to the level. So when you are teaching first year and assessing reading with first year, you focus more on meaning that is explicitly stated in the text using scanning and skimming. When you are dealing with third year students, reading has another definition operationally. Reading is more related to critical thinking, to reacting to the text, trying to find, for example, the meanings which are embedded or hidden or there which are between the lines, or let's say they are in the text, and trying to identify, for example, whether the writer is, for example, the background of the writer from the text that is written. If in cultural studies, and I will just go quickly through this. So here it depends whether you are teaching culture, like when we teach, for example, American culture or British culture, just in the culture itself, or basically you are developing awareness about culture. And this, when we talk about awareness about culture in general, so we move to, let's say, higher levels. And we talk about, for example, the theoretical definition of the construct in culture. They can focus on knowledge or understanding or appreciation of key conceptual. So here we focus on key conceptual frameworks of cultural studies. We talk about symbolic systems, how language is used in cultures, the signs in culture, discourse in shaping meaning in culture. We talk about, for example, material practices, rituals, cultural rituals, behaviors, and institutional, and how they differ from a region to another or country. Power and ideology, for example, how culture reinforces or challenges dominant hierarchies. And then hybridity and fluidity, for example, the blending of evolution, cultural forms, and globalization. So with more advanced levels, the definition of the construct may have or could have or can have, sorry, a methodological dimension. So here we focus more on textual analysis. In your test, you will have analysis of text, for example. Students will be required to make a close reading of films, ads, literature for ideological meaning. What is the ideology behind that text? And then ethnography and audience studies, how real people consume and interpret culture. We focus on, you see, the definition of construct varies, let's say, depending on the level that we are teaching and basically the rationale or the reason behind, let's say, the teaching. Historical materialism, linking cultural forms to economic and social conditions, critical theory, for example, exposing hidden powers and structure and talking about the structure and the systems that are dominating the world and how the dominant cultures, and we talk also about the subordinate cultures. So that's very important. So again, this also, we should also focus that the constructs in cultural studies, they vary. They are basically, they are, when we talk about cultural studies, it's not neutral. It aligns with, for example, social justice, decolonial versus global perspectives. So you're talking about various perspectives here. It's important to highlight that these constructs also, they are fluid, they are contested, and they are context dependent, require interpretive and critical methods for assessment. There is also, they are shaped by who is defining such principles and such concepts. For example, whether the definition coming from the West or it is an indigenous knowledge, for example. So that's again in cultural studies. I will conclude with literature. So definition of construct in literature. So if you talk about the construct of literature, it refers to a set of qualities, functions, and interpretive practices that distinguish literary text from other forms of discourse. So by definition, literature is different from, let's say, other types of discourse. So it is not defined by a single universal feature. It is more subjective. It is conceptual framework. It is shaped by the cultural, the historical, and the theoretical perspectives. So we are dealing with another type of discourse that is subjective, and this is part of the definition of the construct itself. So when we talk about assessing the construct of literature, so we are referring to the measurement of a set of knowledge and skills and cognitive abilities that learners use when engaging with literary text. So our learners, they, for example, read poetry, drama, prose, fiction, okay? And they are engaged with the text. So we try to measure the knowledge and the skills they are using and those cognitive abilities, but in the field of literature. So more specifically, if we want to break the construct of literature, I'm talking here in literature in general, but this can be applied to, for example, poetry, drama, prose, fiction. And I don't want to delve too much into this because I'm not a specialist. But if we talk about this construct, we are talking about literary comprehension. So we try to see whether our learners identify explicit and implicit meaning, themes, characters, setting, plot structure, figurative language, and literary devices. All these can be transformed into, let's say, items in our test. So here, I think, in my personal opinion, when we talk about testing literature, and this is, as I said, my personal opinion, should not be only limited, or assessment of literature should not be only limited to the essay format. We can find other ways through which we can assess literature, not only limited to, let's say, how to call it, the stereotypical or the very, let's say, formulaic way, which is using, let's say, when you test literature, you use an essay. No, there are many other, let's say, ways or methods for testing literature. Literary interpretation, inferring deeper meaning, authorial intentions, symbolic, contextual elements, and then formulating coherent readings of a text, whether we try to measure whether the learner is able to formulate a reading that is coherent, a coherent reading of, let's say, the text. And then we move to critical analysis. Basically, with advanced levels here, we evaluate the effectiveness of literary techniques in specific, let's say, work, relationship between form, style, meaning, comparing perspectives with and across texts, and then contextual awareness, understanding how historical, cultural, or philosophical contexts they shape meaning. Then personal response. Sometimes we ask our learners to respond to a specific literary text when it is relevant, articulating personal engagement, expressing informal opinions about characters, themes, and authorial choices. And then communicative competence in literary discussion. So here, when they discuss a specific work, they need to produce coherent written oral responses, supporting arguments with relevant textual evidence, using appropriate terminology, the terminology that is specific to literature. And here I go back to the idea of using essays. In a previous, let's say, work, I tried to collect different types of tests, for example. And one type of test that I usually use when I teach testing to my students is a test that I found in one institution without mentioning the name. The test was Robinson Crusoe, discuss. This kind of test is a puzzle in itself. It's really puzzling. So what kind of test, what are you measuring? What construct are you measuring here? And here we feel the importance, let's say, of defining the construct. Are you talking about characterization? Are you asking them for a personal response? Are you measuring their communicative competence in the discussion, for example? And the other thing is that teachers, they ask generally students to write essays, whether in cultural studies, whether in writing, or whether, for example, in literature, and the focus is usually on language. If the learner does not know how to write, automatically he or she will get below the average. The language is very decisive in such, let's say, types of tests, especially in the essay format. But we should ask ourselves, are we testing the construct of literature or language? If the student gets below the average, what does that mean? If we try to interpret that, it means that, let's say, the ability of the learner in reading, or let's say in understanding literary text is low, or his language ability is low. And here, this is very important. And this is what some, for example, experts in testing or in assessment, they called it muddied testing. It is muddy testing. There is mud in there because we don't know whether we are testing the ability to understand literary texts or the ability, let's say, to use language properly and appropriately. Okay, for the reflections on construct definition, I'm going to conclude with this slide. I see Besma somehow relieved. Okay. We need to think. I mean, construct definition, so far we looked at this kind of process, but let me say that construct definition should not be limited, let's say, to assessment. It should also be an important component in curriculum design. When we think of our, let's say, the courses that we teach, the content of the courses, what are we teaching to our learners? We should start from, let's say, a theoretical definition and then the subcomponents. Let me tell you, I mean, an example that happened to me personally. I think you were one of my victims, Basma. I started teaching reading. Just I ask my students to read the text and then answer questions. And then after that, have a nice discussion about, let's say, the text. Discussion about the text. So here, if we think about, let's say, teaching reading, there is no focus on, let's say, the skills. We talked about higher order, lower order skills. So basically, in the discussion there, I was teaching speaking and not reading. So it's very important when we teach, when we design courses, when we select the content of our courses, they should be aligned, let's say, to the definition of the construct itself, what we are teaching. Are we teaching speaking, for example? Another example, if I see, for example, assessment of speaking through exposés. I see that teachers, for example, they ask the learners as part of the speaking course to prepare exposés and to present them in front of the audience, and then they get, let's say, a mark. What are we testing here? Are we testing speaking? As far as I know, the theoretical definition of the construct of speaking includes interaction. Is there interaction in exposé? And if we compare that to the tasks that we do on a daily basis with the speaking, let's say, do we really all the time give exposés? How many instances in our lives we give exposés? Are we really teaching speaking there? Are we assessing speaking? So here, basically, some questions need to be raised, and we need to have some kind of reflection on this. In terms of policy, for example, construct definition is also useful at the level of planning and policy and curriculum design. And a very important discussion that we are having these days in Tunisia is about ESP and EMI. So English for specific purposes. Is it in terms of construct, do we really need it today? What is its definition? So why do we need ESP today? Do we really need ESP or EMI? So again, we need to define the construct and then of teaching English in non-English departments. And then after that, operationalize that on the ground. And then see what are our needs and how we can respond to that. So it's, let's say, choices that need to be made, but I think that the idea of defining construct is relevant at the level of assessment, as I have just explained, but it is also relevant at higher levels if we think of curriculum design or, for example, language teaching policy in Tunisia in terms of choices we need to make. We need to understand what kind of English do we need, for example, and to which, let's say, learners. And this is very, very important. Yes, thank you for your attention. And again, thank you for giving me this opportunity. So if you have questions, comments, yes, I can answer all your questions and comments.
Right. Thank you very much for this very comprehensive, detailed presentation, which moves us from the assessment of language skills to cultural studies to literature. I personally really enjoyed when you talked about these constructs and how we can evaluate or assess cultural studies and literature, and how we can move from like less advanced levels, okay, to advanced levels in assessing these constructs. So let me look at the perhaps the chat and invite participants perhaps to write their questions in the chat or just to raise their hand, and I can activate their individual mic to ask questions related to the presentation. Right, so we do have one question, I think. When evaluating students' creative writing, so that's a question by Yasmin Malgat. When evaluating students' creative writing, so when teaching writing, so it's specific, right? Creative writing, what aspects should be prioritized? Creativity, linguistic accuracy, or a combination of the two? And to what extent can creativity itself be reliably assessed? I think that's a very interesting question by Yasmin.
Yes, thank you for this question. It's very interesting in the way that this is what we often discuss, and believe me, that the answer to this question is not easy. And it has to be, let's say, if we start from in general, what is said in general. So we are teaching and writing, and we are measuring, let's say, the ability to write in a creative way. So first, it's very important to understand what is meant by writing in a creative way. So we need to locate where is the creativity? Is the creativity in the style, the writing style? Is the creativity, for example, in the topic? Is the creativity in the use of figurative language and metaphors and all of that? So again, here, it's very important to identify or to find, and really, I encourage you to explore this, to try to find the definition of creativity. What is meant by being creative in writing? And then in that way, you will know exactly where to set your boundaries. Because here we talk about setting boundaries, and we refer to Weir, this Silweir, a famous, let's say, he was my supervisor just years ago. Called as muddy testing. So here, yes, I want to measure the creativity of my students, but they are obliged to write. So the language that they are using and their language ability decides about their level of creativity. How can I separate between the two? It's a question that we also discussed when we talked about writing essays in literature. Where do we put, let's say, the barrier exactly? Should I give, for example, 8 to language and 12 to, let's say, literary skills? Should I give 12 to language and 8 to, for example, the ability to read or to understand literary texts or get engaged? This is the best term, is getting engaged with literary texts. So I think the answer is not yes or no. It's not simple. I think that what I usually say and I usually recommend is that teachers of the subject, they should sit together and they agree using arguments, agree on a specific line. Because, as I said, ethically speaking, so sometimes you can have someone who has a good ability in engaging with literary text, for example, but his or her writing ability, when it is low, does not convey that kind of ability or that kind of knowledge. If we look at the other side now, if we give more importance to language, then if someone writes an essay with a good language, but with a very low ability in reading or understanding literary texts, then he will get the average, he will get 10 because his or her language was okay. So here, I said the answer is not that easy. And I think, and if you even read the literature about that, I mean, as I said, now we don't talk about, let's say, theories. We move to talk about what we call best practices. And the best practices is that within each department, there must be specific meetings between teachers teaching the same subjects and then deciding about the importance of the construct and language relationship between, let's say, language and construct, and trying to come out with clear, concrete or correct, let's say, criteria of, let's say, measuring or the response of the learner. Does that answer the question?
I can't answer for her, but I think it answered the question. And I did have a question that was very similar
Yes.
when you
Yes.
talked about the construct of language or construct of literature. So actually, you answered my question. So I was like, are they separate? Can we separate the language from the literature construct? Can't we talk about integrated kind of constructs that are integrated? But I think that we need to define the construct, like it's literature, it's a kind of language. Cannot really separate them. It's a construct where there are lots of things, right?
In terms of let's say best practices, where I'm no longer referring to theory. In terms of best practices here, when we take specific constructs, we divide it as we did with language skills. There is the linguistic competence. There is the for example, the strategic competence. There is the pragmatic competence. So all these competencies together, they build that kind of construct. And we see that the linguistic competence or language is only one component of all of that. So when we take the construct and we fragment it in a very clear way into, let's say, specific subcomponents, we will be able to be in a position to measure the importance of each component. And that may have kind of, let's say, impact on our scoring key. So we end up having a scoring key that is more detailed, that is gives, let's say, more importance to creativity, for example, at the expense of language. Because language is measured in other, let's say, courses. If we keep giving importance to language in all the courses, then why don't we just give one single test to the learner about language, and that's it, we're done. Do you see what I mean? So this is the point. But if we take each construct, as she mentioned, creative writing, what is meant by creative writing? We try to see the subcomponents and different, let's say, competencies which come into play when we talk about different characteristics of that construct. We'll be able to fragment that, and then our scoring, let's say, key that we will share with other teachers will, let's say, reflect that kind of importance of each subcomponent in our, let's say, construct.
Right. There's another question by Hajar Rabidi. So she's saying, when it comes to critical thinking skills, I think that we should rather start assessing them at early levels or stages. Critical thinking skills are developed over time. What do you think?
So here it depends on the construct that we are measuring, or the subject that we are teaching in more, let's say, practical terms. Critical thinking, if we look at it separately, in speaking, for example, it is much easier than reading. Because when we speak, we talk about simple topics that we can react to them in a critical way. And you have, for example, the person is in front of you. If the meaning is not clear, then you can ask the person to repeat. In reading, it's quite complex because the text, it is there, and your response to the text will depend on your understanding. So first we teach learners how to understand, let's say, the text itself, or the meaning, or the meaning that is explicitly stated in the text. And then we move to a higher level in which we basically try to measure this ability, the ability. So you start by reading a text, understanding that text, relating that text to your background knowledge and to reality and to your context, and then, or compare it to what is said in other texts, and then you react to that text. And that's where we just basically resort to critical thinking. It's a reaction to the text. It's a post-reading, I think, I'm not expert in reading, but I think when we react to the text, it's a post-reading, let's say, reaction. It doesn't happen right in the middle of the text, because you have to finish, understand the text, get it all its meanings, and then react to it. So it's true that critical thinking should be taught, but here, as I said, it depends on the skill that you are teaching, the subject that you are teaching. So critical thinking in reading is not like critical thinking in literature, of course, because you are dealing here in literature, you're dealing with highly complex texts, which are not accessible to lay people like me. So basically, it requires skills, knowledge of, let's say, different levels. So there are various levels of understanding in literature. So, but as I said, if in listening is much easier, because when we listen, and if we frame that within the CLT framework and communication, all of that, we talk about daily matters. We can develop critical thinking, and we look at the text in all, let's say, in its context and things like that. So yes, critical thinking is important. We need to teach our learners from young age, let's say, on this ability to think critically. But again, depending on what you are teaching, when the more the text is structured, the more the text is framed in a written, let's say, mode, the more complex and the less accessible it will become to the learner. So he or she requires, or any learner requires, to develop the skills first, because we should not look at reading. And I try to be, I don't want to be very critical here, but I personally regret the fact of not teaching, for example, reading to the second year or the third year. Because as I said, if you look at reading is a very complex, let's say, subject, very complex skill. If we look at it in a very simple way, we say that people, they read. When you read, for example, a novel, you are reading. When you read, for example, a text of cultural study, or for, let's say, specific about civilization text, you are reading. But no, the reading we are talking about the skill of reading, which extends from, let's say, higher order skills to lower skills to higher order skills, and which starts with the explicit identification of meaning in a text to critical thinking or reacting to, for example, a text. So here, I think we cannot do all of that in the first year, and I regret the fact of not having, let's say, reading taught during the second year or the third year. This is a personal opinion that I keep that I'm sharing with you. So,
right.
Other people could have a different opinion, of course.
Right. Thank you. There are questions where you already answered. So, for example, Wissam said, okay, isn't it high time to consider the testing of the other skills in the baccalaureate exam, like listening and speaking? So I think you already answered this question in the slide, so I won't really go in that. So construct should be defined before designing or preparing a test. So your answer was like, yes. So yes, it
okay, I'm trying to be more practical. I don't think that this is possible for every teacher. So this presentation is like an awareness raising. So let's say that, let's talk in practical terms. A teacher cannot do this. So, for example, if you want to define, for example, a specific construct by yourself, you need something like, for example, a lot of time to do that. You have to refer to the literature, read all the definitions that exist about that specific ability, and then you transform that to an operational definition, and then you transform that into items. And this is very time consuming. So today, with the use of technology, if you are teaching, for example, reading, you just go use technology to find definition of reading, and then you ask about the subcomponents of reading, and here that will help you. And then your added value as a teacher here will be just trying to compare those subcomponents to what you taught in class or the contents of the course that you are teaching. This applies, for example, to secondary school teachers, because they are using, let's say, materials or textbooks which are designed by the ministry. And unfortunately, those, let's say, there was no somehow no construct definition of those abilities, or let's say those skills before the design of, let's say, such materials. So you are doing with what we have. So here it's very important. Your added value as a teacher is to look at the the theoretical definition, and then its subcomponents of the subcomponents of the construct. And then after that, you try to compare your test, whether you are testing reading as it should be or not. For university teachers, we have somehow kind of margin of freedom in which we can somehow define, let's say, what we teach, and then define the construct. But as I said, awareness is very important. Because remember my example, I discovered that I was teaching speaking when I used to be instead of reading. Do you see what I mean? So this is very important. So practically speaking, you look for a definition of the construct, the subcomponents, and then you try to compare the tests that you have the tests that are designed by the other teachers or your colleagues, and then you try to adapt that to see what you are measuring exactly, and especially that will help you, let's say, understand also the idea behind, let's say, the material that is included in the textbook.
Right. Okay. Do we have the time for another question?
Whose time?
Was? Yeah,
That's
your
okay.
time.
No, I know. I'm here to answer questions. I'm
Right.
enjoying
Okay.
this session, actually. I mean, it's no
Right.
problem.
Okay. We do too. So Hannah is asking the following question: to what extent can the teacher experiment with test presentation? So to what extent we can diversify scoring methods, especially at the presence of a strict curriculum, regulations, institution norms, and even societal ones?
Quite difficult as a question. Here, as I said, awareness is important, but you have to work and to be, it's easy to say it, but you have no other solutions. In my opinion, a teacher who has what we call a reflective behavior, who knows that, yes, what I'm doing is wrong, but I am in a system which does not allow me to do what I want. So here, I mean, awareness, as I said, is important. When you know exactly that you are crippled, you cannot, for example, if we take the example of the baccalaureate, for example, we have the same test items, and I did this work of analysis of the baccalaureate, the same test items since 1994 until the present day, the same layout, the same scoring, and even, let's say, the text, they are taken from the same, let's say, uh, journals, not journals, I mean magazines, British magazines or American magazines. And even, let's say, they still ask people to, I mean, until, let's say, a few years ago, there are items in writing in which they ask students to write postcards. We know that Tunisians never write postcards. Have you written a postcard in your life, Basma? Maybe in Britain, not in Tunisia. So you see, just here, just, yeah, we do the
Sorry,
same
I
thing
said many years ago. I
many
did,
years
but many
ago.
years ago. Right. Okay.
But
But my son
if you
has an
think of
assignment
Tunisia,
like that.
yeah, just like an assignment. But
Yeah.
if we think of Tunisians, for example, we don't use postcards to communicate. How can you expect a learner to, let's say, perform well when, let's say, to ask that learner to perform in a very alien, let's say, environment, which is writing postcards? When you ask a learner, for example, describe the city of London in a writing, for example, I'm not talking about baccalaureate here, but this is a topic that I encountered in many institutions. Students, they have never been to London. I went to London several times, but if you ask me to write an essay, I will think a lot and will find that the task is very difficult. When you ask people, for example, in the countryside close to the borders of Algeria, for example, to write about an essay about a day they spend with their families on the beach, and you know that they never go to the beach. And here we can question, I'm sorry, I'll come back to let's say the question of our, let's say, colleague in a few seconds. But if you ask, let's say, and here we can question, let's say, what we call national exams or standardized tests, because we ask students from different regions to write about the same topics, even though, for example, they don't have the experience, they don't have the cultural background, they don't have the ability to write about or to perform in that specific, as I call, alien environment. So this is quite, let's say, difficult, and we have to, it's time to reconsider all of that. It's time, let's say, to reflect on that. Is this clear? So again, if you are operating in a very hostile context, as the one that, like the one you have mentioned, please, it is very important that you stay aware and conscious of that. You learn about the best practices. So focus on your, for example, I'm not saying professional development, but maybe in the future, you will have the opportunity to change things. So if you are well equipped, you are in a position to change things. And in many, let's say, countries, if we think about assessment, like in many countries, So, for example, many countries since 2002, they stopped using standardized tests. Many countries, they no longer have the baccalaureate. They rely more on formative assessment, project-based assessment, portfolio assessment, and different types of assessment, which basically provide an accurate, let's say, assessment of the learner. Yeah, as I said, sometimes you have to work in conformity with the regulations that are, as we call them, there, that are on vigor. But yeah, that's it. But maybe later on, when you are, as I said, well equipped, when you know exactly, when you are aware, when you are conscious, you will have that opportunity, let's say, to change things. And then, yes, you will have for sure that kind of opportunity.
Right. I do have a question, right?
Yes.
So you talked about different other forms for assessing literature other than
Yes.
the essay, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Can you just give us examples of how we can assess literature at university in other ways than essays or academic paragraphs?
Here it depends on because I mean literature is not always written. Yes or no?
Yeah, we have oral
Yeah.
literatures,
Yeah.
oracy,
So
right?
why do we just think of this is the same attitude? Just as I said, I'm not an expert in literature, but this is the same attitude like we have it in the baccalaureate. It has to be written. So when I talk to inspectors, for example, about the baccalaureate, I say, why don't you just administer a speaking test in a speaking item in the baccalaureate? They said it's question of logistics.
Mhm.
I said, but students, now with let's say technology, you can do whatever you want. I mean, I have a colleague who is from the examination board in China, and many years ago, she said to me that 11 million students, they sit for the Gaokao, which is the Chinese baccalaureate, and they sit for the speaking test. Now they are more, I think. Now they are maybe 20 million. And the way they do that is like we test, for example, computer sciences. So they ask students to record or to talk. Let's say now you can use, let's say, interactive testing of speaking. You can, for example, use tests. You have students who go to a specific computer science room in a high school, and then you can record, okay, the way they speak to avatars or the way they speak, let's say, to their other colleagues and other, let's say, students, and then you can record that, and then after that it can be rated. Raters can come at a later stage. You see what I mean? So
Right.
there are many. If we think of literature, I just ask the question, literature is not always written. It is all literature. So here they can perform, they can talk about literature, and then you can get from what they say, as I said, depending. So a component, if we go back to the slide, one of the components is communicating, writing about literature. Communicating is better, communicating about literature. So you can have, as I said, let's say, instances in which they speak about what they know. So it's not only written, as I said, essays. It can be oral. It can be,
Right.
for example, a kind of, let's say, an open discussion, which students they share information. So with the teacher, it can be. There are many other project-based also, and peer, for example, or self, let's say, evaluation or what we call, sorry, self-assessment here. So
Mhm.
um, portfolio assessment. Learners, for example, can keep a portfolio in which they write about literature, and then after that you can just see, and then they can see the progress they're making and they are understanding. So I can't remember, but there are ways of, let's say, assessing literature
Right.
apart from using essays and
The essay.
relying on the assessment of the language ability of the learner. Here, I'm not saying that language is not important. Language is important, but we should also calibrate that in relation to the construct that we are measuring. So we need to, let's say, measure the importance of language within the, let's say, ability that we are assessing. If language is essential, yes, it's important, but sometimes it's not important, but we give language more importance than it requires.
Right. So there is a comment by Dora Haneshi who says, I love when they, I think her students perhaps, they use postcards maybe as a workshop, and they would learn about how other countries use it. But depending on the cultural background, it's difficult. I see your point. So she's commenting like for some cultures maybe it's a common practice to write postcards, but for other cultures, okay, they don't do it, and so you have a point in that, right?
If you go to Britain, you will find many shops selling only postcards. As I said, it's a question of culture.
Of culture,
I mean,
right?
Europe, in many European countries, they have just the culture. Here in Tunisia, no, we have other ways. And we should take, this is why when you, for example, define a construct, there is, as I said, the cultural component that is important. It's the context in which you place the item, or let's say the task. So I am, let's say, testing your ability to write in English. So if I ask you, for example, to write about something that is not related to your culture, so here the difficulty, the task difficulty is not related to language ability. It is related to knowledge about culture. It's not a question of that you do not know how to build sentences and link them together and to form paragraphs, but you don't have the cultural knowledge that will provide you with the words that you will arrange in the paragraphs. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, maybe we talk about authenticity here. Like it's not
Yeah, for
authentic. It's
sure.
not an authentic situation for
It's not
some
authentic,
people in
like
some
asking,
cultures.
as I said, yeah, like as I said, for example, asking, no, not even cultures. When you ask, as I said, learners to perform in certain tasks, for example, that they don't know, they don't have the background knowledge. A learner who has never been to the beach will not be able to describe the kind of activities that he or she will do on the beach. The same thing. So that's it. It's not a question of language. It's a question also. So here the difficulty is somehow, how to call it? It's quite complex. So the difficulty is it's a stratified difficulty. You have a layer over the other.
Right.
Yeah, it's a kind of, let's say, it's made of different layers, for example.
Right. Yasmin again says, okay, my last question is, and we're back to creative writing. Are analytical rubrics the most suitable method for evaluating creative writing? But I think that you already answered a little bit the question, right?
Yeah, to a certain extent, but as I said,
Sure.
analytical rubrics, they are good. If we basically take them or get inspired from a good definition or robust definition of the construct. Because here we talk about analytical scoring and whole scoring. So assessing creative writing is even more, let's say, subjective than assessing writing by itself. Because creativity, it's subjective. What you find best in creative. Or maybe let me formulate my sentence. What I find creative, maybe in your opinion, is not creative, based on what you have witnessed and maybe your teaching experience. You encounter students who are more creative. You see what I mean? So it is quite subjective here. Analytical is important, but again, analytical scoring or analytical rubrics is important, but again, there are certain subjects, like, for example, creative writing, like literature, that include a lot of subjectivity. When we, let's say, rate them analytically, it will make them, let's say, void of any, let's say, originality or creativity. So usually we need at the end. So sometimes the correct essays, and this is quite difficult. When you correct essays, you focus on, let's say, you go through analytical, let's say, scoring, but at the end, you need to have to read again and look at it from a holistic perspective. And as we say in Arabic, تقول يستاهل 10 ولا because it's decisive, basically. It's a passing mark. And as a teacher, sometimes you feel guilty. It's close to 9, but again, I cannot give the student 10, and then this is subjectivity. So analytical scoring does not allow you to have this kind of discipline, because here we talk about objective measurement. Some, let's say, courses, subjects cannot be, let's say, 100% measured objectively, because this is the production of human beings. There's a question about ESP or EMI.
All right, yeah.
Do we need ESP or EMI? Definitely, I would say EMI. Thank you for the question. So if we think of the context now, I'm sorry to tell you that I am the ESP coordinator, ESP center coordinator, and
Yeah.
I did a lot of work in the field of ESP. My MA was about ESP, and I spent, let's say, something half of my life for the ESP center. And I used to teach ESP, but if you think of what is happening in the world today, and I think you worked best a little bit on this. I mean, yeah, we have to shift to, let's say, EMI quickly as possible. The only reason for that is that we are teaching, let's say, science and technology in French. We can ask the question why. In many countries that are still, let's say, considering the use of ESP instead of EMI, is that because they think that English could be a threat to their national identity, like Turkey, for example, or Venezuela, or many other countries. They think that English could be a threat to their identity. But in Tunisia, I mean, like it or not, our mother tongue is Arabic. Now, our identity is related to Arabic. French is, sorry to say, it's the colonizer's language. So here, why do we stick to French? And then we are obliged to teach our students ESP when we should switch, sorry to say it, quickly to English, so that we can avoid, let's say, teaching our students French, and then when they graduate, we teach them ESP, and then they will be obliged to, if you take part in conferences, think of how many conferences about medicine, for example, worldwide, they are, for their language is French.
Yeah.
And think of all the other disciplines. And even our students, even the French themselves, when they want to publish their articles, they publish them in English, like it or not. And think also of, let's say, the kind of amount of effort. And we just spend on teaching, let's say, ESP to our students. And I made an evaluation together with the team of my professor, my honor professor, Mohammed Daoud, and let's say, Khalid Barkawi. And we did an evaluation of ESP in Tunisia and the ESP Center, and a lot of effort is deployed. That was done in the 1990s. That was, let's say, as we can call it, en vogue in the 1990s. But now, look at the university around the world. Look at our students when they go to France, when they want to study. Look at Saudi Arabia, look at Kuwait, look at the Emirates. All of them are using English. So the shift to English was very smooth for them because they understood that the business, educational business, is a thriving business. And if you want to attract, let's say, learners from many countries, from all over the world, you have even the Germans. I mean, if you look at the Germans, for example, they are very attached to their language. And now if you go to German universities, you will find that, let's say, different programs in medicine, in computer science, in technology, in architecture, they are offered in English. Why? Because they want to attract, let's say, foreign students, because it's a whole business. And it's a very thriving business. So I don't know why. Thank you for the question, but it's a clear. So in my opinion, let's say, if we do not, let's say, migrate to EMI, at least we can go through, we can prepare a transitional period in which we just move quickly from ESP to EMI. We invest in ESP and then to prepare the ground for EMI, because I think we are among let's say, the few countries, the very few countries, in which, for example, learners, they start learning maths in Arabic, then they learn it in French, and then at university they go back to learn it in English, or let's say to publish and do research in English, which is quite consuming, let's say, effort, money, and energy, and everything. And well, there are many students that we lose on the way due to this, what we call language shift, which happens at the ninth grade when they shift from Arabic to French, and then which happens at university basically when, for example, they study in French, and then they are when they want to do research, they're obliged to do research in English. But this is another topic, so we can talk. I don't know whether you agree, Besma, or not concerning this. I know that you did some
I do.
research about this.
Yeah, I do agree that it's very confusing for students at different levels, not only secondary, primary, secondary, to really learn three languages since primary school, then to keep on switching between them without really mastering all of them really very, very well, and then switching to learn them in switching, like attending subjects like science and maths in French, and then in Arabic, and then in English. So yeah, I totally agree that it's really a waste of effort and energy, and it's really frustrating and confusing for them. So they end up not really mastering any of the languages, right? That they are supposed to master. Okay. So thank you very much, Moaz, for this very, very insightful presentation, for your generosity in interacting with all the
I
participants.
enjoy these events. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We did enjoy receiving you at our pedagogical seminars. If you want to make another presentation on EMI and ESP, please feel
Yeah, why
free.
not? Yes.
Please feel free to suggest one, and we would really be very happy to have you here. If there is any no question, there are no questions. We'll leave Okea this third webinar. I would like to thank all the participants for their interest in these webinars, and for their really for the questions, for their interaction with all our presenters, and we look forward to seeing you in future webinars with other topics. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Goodbye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Oh, the participants would like to know if you can send the PowerPoint slides.
Yeah.
Not
why
now,
not?
not now,
now,
okay. But I can share them. You can
Yes,
share them with
sure.
me in a PDF, right, as a PDF file, and I will share them with
And they
with
will
all the
also find
participants.
the recording of the whole, let's say,
Yes, okay.
session, of course.
And there will be the recording too, right? Okay.
Okay. Thank you very
Okay,
much.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
all. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.